the actual information that we'll be pushing back to QuickBooks Online will be a little bit tougher to work out. So just have more work on your own plate if you do it that way. So starting off with setting up the right tax rates in QuickBooks Online and having your settings and your customers there already is really nice. Then when you go to create the integration and then start submitting in items, efficiency when you're going through that first initial onslaught of receipts from people. So in QuickBooks Online, most people will have their standard tax. So typically you'll have one of these or maybe many of these if it's a national business. For purposes of this demo, set up most of them, and within the actual rates, created a few small ones that well, that's awesome. It's not supposed to come up. Okay, so a few of them that we'll be talking about a little bit further on. So the ones you'll notice here, just we've created some Manitoba, some BC, some standard GST items, and Ontario items, Nova Scotia. So these will be the sort of basis for some of the entries that we examples we go through in Receipt Bank. Once all of this is set up and there's nothing left to set up from a tax perspective, we'll head over into Receipt Bank and then actually start the integration. From the integration side, you can find that up on the Account Settings menu and then on the Integration tab on the left. From here, I'll actually redo it so you can. It never hurts to reconnect with QuickBooks Online, and in fact, anytime a new tax rate is introduced on the QuickBooks system, recently we've needed to reconnect the integration in order for it to pick up that new rate quickly. So from this perspective, we'll do this again. Shouldn't take very long. The reason I wanted to go through this again instead of just skip by it was because there's an element of the setup relating to payment methods that is pretty important and is quite key to having this setup work. So once we've authorized the connection, it'll pop back into Receipt Bank, and then with a pop-up, bring up some test methods. Now the first time you set this up, there won't be any data here, and this is just here because I had created it previously. But if you wanted to, you could create the payment methods that were brought in from, or that exist in QuickBooks Online, so whether it's credit cards or checking accounts, savings accounts, etc. These can all be set up. Now, in order to actually publish over to QuickBooks Online, the association to bank accounts is required. So from this set, actually coming over and picking this from the available items from QuickBooks is important. Everything else isn't necessary, but the bank account settings are. So once that's finished, we're on to the next step. Now, they've done a really good job of keeping it really simple, so there isn't that many settings to change, which is kind of nice. But it is kind of important to understand the ramifications of a couple of these fields. So the first field under Default Publish to Destination, if you're doing the majority of one type over the other, you can choose so. Cash, check, and credit card typically perform the same action in QuickBooks, where they're sending over an expense, and the bill will send over the bill. So if the majority of your items aren't receipts but they're invoices, you could choose bill. But I typically see people just choosing cash and moving on because it's not that important really. Because you can overwrite that when you're submitting them and actually going through the receipts. I should probably preface that by saying we're approaching this this sort of philosophy of settings based on a review and then a post of every single transaction. We aren't really, and I know most of the team isn't, a really big fan of auto-sync, and the auto-syncing in our experience has worked when it's on a supplier by supplier basis and you're confident that things are working well. But from a straight automatically publish all items perspective, we typically keep that off until the system is up and running, and even at that point tend to leave it off so that we can keep our accuracy within Receipt Bank and then use the tools that Receipt Bank's built in order to make things a little bit more efficient on the QuickBooks Online side. So the next important piece is the default tax rate. And again, all of this information is in the manual that will be sent out afterwards. So you can see that there's lots of screenshots, there's lots of information, the order is all here. And if you look at the table of contents, it does cover most of the stuff that we'll be covering today. On the side here, the default tax rate is important because this is the rate that will be used whenever the extracted amount option in the tax drop-down list will be chosen. So if the majority of your taxes are in Ontario, then choose the HST Ontario rate or something like that. What I would caution you at this point is to keep this default rate to a singular actual code instead of one that has a compound nature, such as BC or Manitoba. And we'll get to that a little bit later on, but for now and for illustration purposes, it's very kind of key to choose that singular default tax rate. Other settings here are typically just left as you sort of move along. You can obviously change those as needed, but the scope of this webinar is really about sales tax. So as this directly relates, we'll definitely move on from here. So now that this is set, and maybe if you haven't already created that link back to your payment methods, if you have to, you can come back into the maintain list section and go into payment methods. And this is where you can again select those bank accounts so you don't have to reinitialize the setup every single time. Again, very important if you do choose one of these during the receipt posting phase. We're on to the details. All right, that's pretty good, only 13 minutes in. The first item that we're going to address is an Apple receipt, and there's only a few here for this demo purpose, but we'll go through each one individually and explain what we're going to go through. So on this Apple receipt, you'll notice that the HST using Ontario, just as an easy example, is calculated at $264.85, and then on the actual receipt in Receipt Bank, you'll notice that they would have used the extracted amount of $264.85. So anytime a supplier default isn't turned on for a tax rate, or anytime a tax rate isn't applied to a supplier in terms of a default setting, this extracted amount will most likely be used by the Receipt Bank team. And that is okay. Now, the idea of choosing a tax drop-down list can be used for speeding up entry or making things more accurate, as we'll get into meals and entertainment expenses later. But the difference between choosing extracted amount and then just coming down here and choosing HST Ontario has no bearing on this screen specifically, but it does have a bearing on how it's posted back into QuickBooks. So under the first scenario, $264.85, it will use the default setting that we talked about earlier in the integration settings for the posting. So if this was to go through, we'll post it, and then when it comes back into QuickBooks Online, you'll see the HST Ontario will be used on the bottom for the rates. If we were to use GST and pretend like this GST amount was actually accurate, then it would actually use the GST amount in the calculations within the QuickBooks Online item, and then ignore the top level. But it'll use this to post the correct amounts through. For those of you that have obviously been users of this for a long time, there's been lots of iterations with the API, and some of the stuff that we're going through now may have been issues in the past, but for now they've been fixed, and that's why we're kind of going through this way. So if you have experienced those, feel free to bring it up too. But we've definitely seen those enhancements over the last little bit. So we'll go back to extracted amount, and really for posting purposes, And for setting up the next few receipts, it's really important to kind of understand what this payment section means on the bottom. If a payment method isn't selected, then you're not able to actually post something through. So it'll tell you that it says please select bank account on the bottom, and once you do, it'll use those settings we went through earlier to tell it which bank account to push it through. And because these items were selected as cash based off the default, this is what will actually be used when it gets posted over as an expense. If this was an Apple bill that wasn't paid, bad example, you could choose the bill option, and then this will actually create a bill back in QuickBooks to be paid versus an expense. So we'll leave it as cash for now, and for these settings, there really isn't much to go over besides those very basic distinguishing factors between the tax. So might as well publish it, and while that's publishing, we'll come back over to the expenses. And so that we're not always waiting for the API to play, I posted things just prior to this webinar just to make sure everything's coming smoothly, and here's how it will be posted. So even though it did say extracted amount, remember how it was going to be using the default tax rate, that's what shows here, all very straightforward. And under the transaction journal, we'll be able to see that the right amount has gone into the GST payable account, and we're happy with everything else. Okay, so that's that one. The next item is actually going to be the first real bit of meat that we're going to get into today. So we're going to go into meals and entertainment, because I know that this has been one of those areas that a lot of people have had questions about. I know we spend a lot of time talking to other accountants about it too, and it is doable, it is workable. It's just there's a few different things that are really important to note and understand what restrictions exist. So that's what we'll do right now. This is an Ontario-based, my bad. Again, playing around. Thank you. All right. So from this perspective, this is an invoice that would have been brought up from Receipt Bank's engines. Again, the extracted amount would have picked out the HST 307, hopefully, and from there we've pre-coded a couple things to entertainment and put it in a description. I'll just come out and say it. The way that we like to post meals and entertainment expenses is by taking the HST amount and then just dividing it by 2 and putting in the tax rate. Now I know that's very counterintuitive to a lot of how a lot of different things in the past that people have done in QuickBooks and other applications, but I'll show you a couple of the limitations here shortly. But if you were to take 307 and divide that by 2, you're going to have an amount of 154. So by putting 154 and pressing tab, and all else being equal, when this publishes, even though there's a tip, that 154 will be the only thing that gets coded to that HST Ontario GST portion, because that was our default that we set up earlier. And because this is kind of a good one to look at, we'll wait for this to post, unless I can find the one that I did earlier here. All right. Just playing around with dates. Sorry about that. Okay, I deleted it. Beautiful. So once that, actually, I'll just wait a few seconds because that is a pretty good one to use in terms of looking at it. All right, so it's still publishing here. Shouldn't take much longer. Today the time's been about 20 or 30 seconds, and then it goes through. Should have hold music or something. All right, maybe we will move on. Actually, we won't because I'd like to see it through. Okay, good. So we're here. Go back to expenses, and we'll come through to the POG. I think the date on this one was a little bit earlier. Yeah, there it is. So you can see right off the bat that in the summary you can see $1.54 was coded to tax with the full $31 being pushed through. And by posting this, you can see that it breaks it out. And this is what I know upsets a lot of people, that the tip isn't perfectly aligned with what the tip amount is on the receipt. But in reality, what's getting coded to the expense is correct, and what's getting coded to the sales tax account is correct. So by having that certainty, and by reviewing the transaction journal that supports that, where $1.54 is coming, I don't see a big issue with having the tip not, specifically labeled as tip, but that's just me. So I think that might be the piece that might spark the debate a bit, but that's why that's the easiest way to do this. Excuse me. Okay, so back to Receipt Bank. There are other options to posting this if you do want to show the tip, and I was going to skip through that, but I know that this is going to be somewhat important. If you did want to do that, the requirements are for you to create a few lines, create a really funky or inverted tax rate, and move on. I think towards the end of this this presentation, we'll actually get into what an inverted tax rate is and how it relates back to the receipts. But just so you know, if you did need to have the tip broken out verbatim, it takes a little bit more work, which is kind of counterintuitive to using Receipt Bank. But from that perspective, just know that it does exist. All right. So let's go back to the inbox, and we'll pick a BC company now, so the fake company one. This is another meaty part of this, so I apologize for the sort of technical stuff here, but I guess that's what we're all here for. The idea of posting amounts through to QuickBooks Online when you're in BC, and you can't use the compounded rate as the default due to some issues we're having obviously right now at the API, requires a little bit of a workaround. But it doesn't have to be. So again, the easiest way to push something through from this perspective, even though Receipt Bank may take $12 and sum up the 5 and the 7, sometimes they'll put 5, sometimes they'll put 0. Obviously getting really, really good now, but if 12 is the extracted amount and you wanted to just push through the 5, as you're ripping through, click 5, push it in, choose the actual rate. Now it's ready to publish. You publish, and that 5% will go through. If you need the PST to be broken out, right now there is obviously a small issue with not being able to select that PST amount. But if you did, you could. But again, I just like choosing the 5 amount and pushing it through. If we did actually, we'll just kind of skip over it. But you could from here select the PST rates, or sorry, the GST rates for BC. If we see it here, not HST, PST BC. I think that's it. Good. So that's not working either. I'm gonna move on. There it is. GST PST BC. So the 12 will be here. Thanks. And then you can post that through. It'll do its same entry just like it would if you put the 5, but it's completely up to you. You can choose that or put the 5 and move on. I'll put the GST PST piece and publish it just to see what that looks like again. But from the fake company transaction that was already posted through, bad example, we'll move on. So that was a very simplistic BC example, just selecting the tax rate and moving on. Now is the inverse tax rates. So this is what I know we've all been sort of talking around. We're about 25 minutes in, so it's good time to bring it up. Setting up an inverse tax rate is a scary term, I guess, if you've never used it before. But the math behind it is solid. So before we get into the math, I just want to explain why we're doing this. When you use inverted rates versus the actual rates that are provided by QBO, it allows you to take a total number, which is taken off of a receipt bank item, and then apply an amount. And I can bring these up here because they're here. If we kind of just look at this, these companies, these provinces that have PST or a component of, ignore Quebec here for a second, but at least for Manitoba, BC, and Saskatchewan, you can use these rates as they are used in receipt bank from a drop-down list perspective. I think we'll use this one here as an example from Manitoba. I want to show you the result, and then we'll go back to the math and the actual thought process behind it. So I created a tax rate in QuickBooks Online that is called GST on purchases with PST included in the total. And by doing this, sorry, this is Manitoba, my bad. 105.40, I think I might have had something here. Lovely. Okay. Thank you. Something's up. But let's go through the math first, and then we'll go back to this in a second. I think the tip is actually the piece throwing it off there, so we'll go back and actually do the work afterwards. Sorry about that. I should have prepped that a little bit better. So an extracted amount and an actual percentage, what does that really mean? So if we use Manitoba as an example, Manitoba has 5% GST and 8% RST. So with the math behind it, you have let's use a $100 base. You'd be adding in $5 for GST and then $8 for RST for $113. If we were to back out the GST, the 5, we're left with 108 as a base. And I know this kind of gets a little bit weird, but from this 108, if we were to take the $5 of GST and divide this into the $108, we'd be able to receive a rate that, when used to calculate something from a tax inclusive amount, will break out the GST and post just that GST portion. So I know it's a mouthful. If it's the first time you've heard of it, if you've seen this a lot, then obviously it's not new news. But this 46296 is exactly the rate that would be used for Manitoba. And when we go back over into Receipt Bank, we'll use this rate. But first you have to enter it into QuickBooks. So the question is, how do you enter it into QuickBooks? Pretty simple. Under Sales Tax, hit New Amounts here. Go to an additional tax code. From here, we've been using the tax rate names here to keep them kind of standard. I don't think I've added a Saskatchewan one in this demo company, so I'll do that here. We're going to say it's the Canada Revenue Agency because we want this to be from the GST portion, and then put this to purchases. The rate itself will be 4.769. I know we're doing a hard one here with the tip, so maybe we'll go back to a more simpler one afterward, just to illustrate. 4.769. The tax will be for ITCs, and then that's the setup for it. Once we press done, it'll be labeled or included in part of the GST HST portion. You can see right here, GST on purchases Saskatchewan. It's now been created, similar to the BC and the Manitoba ones. And because this has the tip, we'll come back to this in a second, because we'll have to break that out. But from the BC one, if we were to use that $112 base and then come back and use the BC PC included, once it loads, you can see there faintly how it picks up the $5 directly and then can post that through. So the math is solid, the logic is solid. And then, you kind of want to know, like, why would you use this? And when you're posting through for meals and entertainment items, it becomes pretty apparent when you want to break out the tips. So let's go over to that one with the tip for Remington's. And we'll use this as an example. So Right off the bat, we know a few things. We know that the total is 105.40, and that total amount came through okay. We know that the GST is $4, but we want it to be $2 when it goes through. And we know that the base prior is $90.40. So knowing those three items, we can set this extracted amount, this tax rate, back to 0. And then come over into the edit line items amount. When we're in the line items, you can break out the tip for $15. Keep the extracted amount as 0 if you want. Found out you can enter this in. Running into some issues earlier where you couldn't. Just say meal, not meal. And remember that the base before the tip was 90.40. So on 90.40, you can come in here, and this is where the tax rate actually comes into play. So if we're going to choose the amount, I think it's up here, GST on purchases Manitoba, RST included. Of course I had to skip ahead, sorry. You can see that the $4 would have been taken. Now, using the same logic, you could also do the 50% meals and entertainment calculation. So I skipped over the wrong piece, sorry about that. But if you were to take the math related to taking 50% of that, you'd be able to use one that I created earlier. So I'll go through the math here in a second. See how that now changed to $2? Everybody's happy, and again, I'll go back to the math here in a second. But I created one using similar logic to grab $2, pressing close. Now everything's working, and we can press the publish button, and things will get posted now with the tip on the right expense line and the amount of tax broken out correctly for the $2. So these were the two that I sent through earlier. We'll go through and make sure that, actually this was me playing with one, so it'd be the one above it. Perfect. So you can see where it says tip on one with the $15 of exempt, and then the meal comes through using an amount that is equal to, and because I know probably a lot of math geeks want to see this, I know I would, under POG. Sorry, wrong one, Remington's. You can see how it's in the archive and it was posted okay. The math for the 8840 relates to the 80 plus half of the GST plus the full amount of the RST. So there's the 8840. And when you use that amount with the inverted rate that we calculated, it'll come up with that $2. So how do you get to this 2.26, which is something we haven't talked about just yet, but it's similar to the other math? Well, what you do is, I should have brought a spreadsheet out here, but you take 2.5 is the amount you want to divide into the main number, right? So if you say we're dealing with $100 and you've got $5 of GST, you've got $8 a thing, you're dealing with $113. But if you back out half of the GST, which is 2.5, you'll have $110. So we'll go back to the document here that Dave wrote in a second. But once you've gotten that $110 as the bottom amount, you can say divide 2.5 into 110.5, and you're going to get that number, 2.2624. So the good news is that this is all written down and will be passed out afterwards, but it is it's essential in order to use Receipt Bank and QuickBooks Online in the way that they've built it, so that you can get this sort of information without creating a lot of workarounds. So again, it's not to say that it's not the best way, but I think it's a pretty decent way once it's set up and you understand the actual rates. And you only have to set it up once, then you know, every time you go into Receipt Bank, you'll only ever have to create the two edit lines, throw out the tip, and be done while you select the other rate. I know we'll have a lot of questions. I can see a bunch of them coming in, which is good. We'll get to those pretty soon. We're 35 minutes in, so we should be wrapping up the main presentation portion really quickly. But if we were, just to come back and look at this, you can see how even though I had the 2 here before, the third one did post through with the same $2 coming through. And if we were to click on it, it does show the tip in the meal. One thing I promised in the beginning, which I didn't show just yet, is the actual transaction journal behind this. So you can gather that it represents what you'd expect, the tip broken out accurately, the base portion here for the amount to be calculated on an exclusive basis, and then the $2 coming through. So it works. Just thinking, is that enough for this until we get into questions? I think so. There was maybe one other one. Let's just see if it's any different. McDonald's. Okay, I'll show you this one. This is a really interesting one. So this is another Manitoba receipt from McDonald's. You can see that the drive-through total was $3.02. I Googled this one, so I don't know who's eating the hamburger and French fries, but the GST is 13 cents. So if this was the receipt bank guys bringing this through, hopefully, 21 plus 13 would be extracted as the amount, and it would be 34 cents. But if that wasn't the case, and you didn't want to have to search around and type in the 13 number, you could use that inverted rate for MB. And when you do select it, you can see that 13 cents comes up, the 13 piece is here, and then because everything is, it's fine down here, we'll press publish, and you can go on. So I think that should be everything for the main presentation piece. If we just go back to the document, because I said we'd go back, here are the percentages that you can use. Again, ignore Quebec here just for a second, but for BC, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, absolutely go ahead and do this. If you need to use it for Quebec, you can in this place, but there's some circumstances there you'd want to play around with a bit. So this is in the document. There's some write-up, but there's also instructions on how to click and create the items and create the taxes, and then using the math here, actually figure out how that was done. So there's the breakdown, and then how it shows back again in Receipt Bank. So 40 minutes, okay, good. So how this will work, Dave's just going to pass through some questions as they've come in through the GoToMeeting piece, and then we'll try to address them. So thanks for that. All right, so the first question is from Tiffany. Hi, Tiffany. It says, so would you leave the default tax code blank if you're in BC? Most of our clients would have a default of GST and PST. Anya, sorry, my bad. That's not from Tiffany. That's from Anya. My very, very sorry. So no, leaving a tax code as blank actually is impossible to post from. So it's necessary for the integrations to work, and it's because you need to have a basis for how the calculations will work in the background. Now, that used to be how it was. I like how it's posting in through now using what you select in the drop down, but it is required right now, so you can't actually leave that blank. Next question is from Michelle, I think, Michael or Michelle. It says, for meals, what happens when you have two tax levels? So in Quebec, we have GST and QST on meals, and only 50% of each can be claimed. So this is, again, where you'd use those edit line items and choose the 50% rates for the items that are 50% deductible, and then the remainder just gets coded back to the expense as part of the posting. So if you remember that receipt that we used, I think it was Remington's, you could just make sure that the tax rates that you've created are customized for both, and then select those customized rates for the QST and the GST from the inverse rate perspective, and then the right amount will then get posted up. Again, there's other ways that you can do it, but that's the way that we've been doing it. So only 2 questions so far coming in from Dave. I know he's been answering a lot of them. I can see them going through here on the screen. Is there anything else from a question perspective, Dave, that you wanted to post through? Okay, so they've all been really, really specific questions for people's situations that have some privacy piece, so we're all good there. Adam, if there's no other questions, is there anything that you wanted to cover or go into more detail on?
Chad, I'm just wondering if some of those specific questions, and maybe Dave, you've been sifting through them as they've been coming in, if any of them you think that are relevant, especially to the little bit more complex provinces like BC or Quebec, where they have multiple tax rates. Dave, is there anything that came in that you thought might be beneficial?
No, he took care of them, and most of the questions were all related to stuff that was covered. So it was just a clarification on a few pieces. So the good news is that it's only 42 minutes in, and we didn't have to take the whole hour. But happy to stay and answer if there is any more questions that would be kind of relevant for the group. So if you have anything, just please shout it through. If not, I don't know if it's necessary, Adam, to go over any of the items again, but it's your call.
No, I think we're good, and we are going to get the recording to everybody, so they'll have this as a reference. We also have that tax manual, so I think we'll just review it beforehand, make sure everything's accurate. If there are any adjustments we have to make, we'll do that before we send it out. But other than that, no, Chad, this is incredibly helpful, so thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I know as Receipt Bank continues to adjust to make your lives easier, we'll constantly update you with any new changes that are going to come in the tax settings. And our development team, as well as Intuit's, is working hard just to make it as easy as possible from a setup standpoint. So I think with that note, yeah, Dave, unless they've sent anything your way, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And we'll be sure to get you guys the recording. Chad, Dave, thanks so much. And hopefully we can do something like this again soon.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
Awesome. Cheers.